Today I have an iPad of the 10th generation here. It's in the somewhat refreshing color of yellow. I'm going to unbox the iPad to show you what's inside the box and also compare it to an older iPad. Unfortunately, this is not an iPad of the 9th generation, it is a 6th generation iPad. So this iPad is a little bit smaller than the new 10th generation iPad and also the iPad of the 9th generation. But we'll get to the comparison a little later. I'll also tell you who this new iPad is suitable for and which iPads you should actually compare it to if you want to get a new iPad. But for now, let's unbox the iPad. And it's really easy to do. All you have to do in the end is peel off these two strips at the back, and then the lid can be taken off, and the iPad is immediately visible, but it's still wrapped in a protective case. We take off this protective cover, and now we take a closer look at the new iPad. I must honestly say that I actually like the yellow color. It's less flashy than I actually expected it to be. This iPad was chosen by my daughter. I would not have chosen the yellow color for myself. The yellow color is a little less aggressive than you would expect though. It's slightly matte, has maybe a slight mustard yellow tint to it, and as I said, is a little less flashy than I would have expected. Here you can see a comparison between the 6th generation iPad and the new iPad. It's noticeable that the new iPad is clearly larger after all. If we put the old 6th generation iPad on top of the new iPad, you can see how big the difference is. Apart from the size, these two iPads also differ clearly in terms of design. The old 6th generation iPad still has rounded edges that correspond to the original iPad design. The new iPad, on the other hand, has much more angular edges and thus looks a bit more modern. In terms of dimensions, the 10th generation iPad is more or less the same size as the 9th generation iPad. However, it has a slightly larger display and slimmer bezels. Before we turn on the iPad and take a closer look at it, let's take a quick look at the packaging. Inside the box is the usual paperwork, of course. But there's also a USB-C to USB-C cable here, and interestingly, a USB-C charger. Although I own a lot of electronic devices, this one is interestingly my first proper USB-C charger, so I still think it's good that Apple includes one in this case. Alright, let's now take a slightly closer look at the iPad. Unlike the iPad of the 9th generation, the new iPad no longer has a physical button on the front. And of course, down here, we have the much discussed USB-C port. As I'm sure you know, the 9th generation iPad still has a lightning connector. However, Apple has now admitted that all Apple devices that will be released in the future are going to have a USB-C port for better or worse. The iPad has relatively large speakers on the underside, and there is also a physical button here, which also has been nicely designed. And here at the back, of course, is the camera. The camera is one of the few crucial differences between the 10th generation iPad and the 9th generation iPad. Unlike the iPad of the 9th generation, you can shoot videos in 4K with this camera. Then there are two volume buttons on the side. What has been met with surprise by many is that the new iPad supports the 1st generation Apple Pencil and not the 2nd generation Apple Pencil. One assumes that this has to do with the new front camera, but that is probably just an assumption. For me, it's not bad news at all, because I actually only own a 1st generation Apple Pencil. However, I cannot connect it today because I do not have an adapter yet. However, the adapter is already ordered and should arrive in 2 weeks. Well, let's turn on the iPad. As usual, we are greeted by Apple and I quickly run through the setup process. And here you can see the iPad turned on. The display makes a very good impression on me, but you should of course remember that, as I mentioned, I'm used to a 6th generation iPad. And as you can see here in direct comparison, the 6th generation iPad has a much smaller display. This is even more noticeable when it is turned on. Of course, this is also due to the much smaller bezels of the new iPad. It is simply noticeable here that this is a new and revised product from Apple. If we now start the browser, for example, then it is also noticeable that the usable screen is significantly bigger and the 10th generation iPad offers a relatively large screen. So who should buy this iPad? The 10th generation iPad has been heavily criticized in recent days. Many reviewers felt that this iPad made little sense in terms of price. On the one hand, it is significantly more expensive than the 9th generation iPad and can therefore no longer be considered an entry-level iPad. On the other hand, the leap to the iPad Air does not seem so big that one might not add the missing dollars at this price, especially because the iPad Air is relatively often available at a reduced price. What is the difference between this iPad and the iPad of the 9th generation? The 10th generation iPad has a slightly faster chip. As mentioned, it has a new camera that can now shoot videos in 4K. It has the USB-C port, of course, and the front camera can shoot in landscape mode, which is a great advantage for video conferencing, for example, because you can now use the iPad in landscape mode without any problems. The display is also minimally larger than the display on the 9th generation iPad, and the new iPad is also slightly thinner. That's a lot of small improvements. These differences probably won't make much of a difference in everyday use. Especially if you use the iPad mainly to surf the web or watch videos, then you will hardly notice a difference between the 9th generation iPad and a 10th generation iPad. For me, the biggest difference is in the design. The 10th generation iPad simply looks more modern and better. Whether that's enough for you to choose this iPad over the 9th generation iPad is something only you can say, of course. On the other hand, if you often use your iPad for work as well and are a power user, then you might want to consider the iPad Air. Unlike this iPad, the iPad Air has an M1 chip, which is of course much faster. Most importantly, the iPad Air also has a better display, which may very well make a difference in everyday use. The iPad Air also supports the 2nd generation Apple Pencil and has a bit more RAM. As I said, this iPad here is right in between the iPad Air and the 9th generation iPad. It's not really an entry-level device, it's a bit too expensive for that. Personally though, I'm happy with the design, it looks good, and I'm not planning on replacing my laptop with this iPad at the moment. Of course, which device is right for you personally depends on your needs and preferences. As far as prices go, there can always be deals, especially on the older devices. I put links to current offers for all 3 iPads in the video description, so you can always check the current price. If this video was interesting for you, give me a like as feedback. There will be more videos about the iPad, so stay tuned and see you next time.